Good day, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Managing Your Perimeter. I'm Mel Lukens, along with PJ O'Neill, and we're going to be your hosts. I'm truly honored to be a part of the Arcus Group podcast team. The title of this series is called Managing Your Perimeter. This particular segment, it's more than just fence. And we're going to take a quick look at some of the factors and influences for a secure perimeter. I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend of more than 75 years, PJ.
Thank you, Mel. I didn't know we'd known each other that long. Feels like it almost every day now, though. You know, I think this is a time to introduce people to who we really are. You hear about all these different experts that go on TV and talk about what they think they know. What we are is actual boots on the ground experts. We've slung the bike rack. We've driven the forklifts. We've stacked the sandbags. We've slung steel with the best of them. So when we talk about all of these different builds and site visits and all of that, we know them intimately and we know what we're talking about. I'm really excited to dive in and talk with our inaugural episodic guest. Mike Reddy is a seasoned former senior law enforcement official at all levels. He is now the director of production and special event security for a major national Hollywood studio, international, I guess. And we're thrilled to have you on, Mike. Thanks for joining us and looking forward to hearing from you.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you all.
So, Mike, this is Mel. You and I have had quite a history of working together, but in all of those years, even before we started working together, when you started a perimeter plan, what was the most important first step that you considered when deciding on a perimeter security plan?
Well, the first thing you really need to look at is what exactly are you trying to accomplish with your perimeter? What is your specific need, or what is your threat if it is a security related perimeter? Are you someplace where you may be trying to prevent an IED from being detonated near a site? Or is it something as simple as keeping people who do not have tickets out of an event? So you really have to look at the scale of your event and who you anticipate trying to secure this perimeter both for, and also who you're trying to keep out.
All right. Well, Mike, you mentioned the role, what the event itself is. Do you take it in your role in Hollywood land? Do you guys do kind of threat assessments on your stars? What role does threat assessment play in your overall former life?
Absolutely. People perform, and you can call them threat assessments or risk assessments, or you can just say an assessment. It may not involve any risk or threat at all, but when you start to look at your perimeter, whether you're trying to secure a large scale government event, such as a summit or say an inauguration, or if you're doing something corporate, maybe it's a shareholders meeting, or maybe you're simply just doing a new product rollout and you need to control some foot traffic or some crowds around a particular place. Those are all perimeters that you're actually going to conduct kind of the same type of evaluation for anything that you want, and we do look at our risk in Hollywood. We do look at the type of film. Is it controversial? What's our location of our event? Are we in an area where perhaps we have these all the time and people are used to them, or have we moved a perimeter to a part of town where maybe it's a little bit more risky because it goes with the film? So there's always an assessment that you can do to kind of determine what footprint you need to best suit your event.
So, Mike, you and I have worked a number of events along with PJ. And is there, and if so, what is it, a single factor, or is it just so many multiple factors that you use to decide what your plan will entail and which assets you might bring to bear on that plan?
There are multiple considerations. There's obviously your threat. Are you securing a presidential site or a summit site, as we talked about earlier, where there are multiple heads of state there, to where your security plan is going to be the absolute highest you can get? So we're talking, vehicle mitigation efforts. We are talking serious crowd mitigation efforts, such as our rock and roll fence that we have used. Or is it something where, it is a lower level type of an event where maybe bike rack is sufficient just to direct people and keep them around? So those are things, that certainly come into play at first. Second thing you always have to look at is access. How are you going to get your people into your event? Do you have a easily accessible route that will fit into your perimeter, or do you have to design that route and build that into your perimeter somehow? Then there's finally the end is public accessibility. Is you may not be in the have the opportunity to just go in and take streets over and close sidewalks and take a chunk of a city for your own use. You may be doing a private event where you only have a certain amount of sidewalk or a certain amount of street. You're not able to just close things down, or it may be cost prohibitive because of the cost of permitting and closures and personnel from the local government that are required to do that. So that's something certainly is how is it perceived to the public of, what you're taking, and certainly optics.
And Mike, I'm glad you brought up optics, because I was going to touch on that, or actually get you to touch on that a little bit, because there's really two factors with optics. Obviously, there's the visual aspect of it, but then there's also the First Amendment aspect to it too. And that's something that I know we've always paid attention to, but just discuss that a little bit and how that gets folded into the plan.
Well,
absolutely.
Let me break in here real quick also to add on to that, Mel. I'd say there's probably one more consideration on that side is the political optics, not just visual, not just the public, but sometimes political decisions are made and security decisions are made. How does that sometimes play into what you guys do, Mike?
Certainly. So take, for example, doing a movie premiere in New York City. We would like to take the sidewalk, put our red carpet out on the sidewalk, direct pedestrian traffic to go down the street and cross the street and go away. But there are neighborhoods in New York where that simply isn't possible. The neighborhoods will basically revolt against you. So you have to kind of build in some type of pedestrian bypass for these types of things. And that goes into your perimeter, because it sometimes brings people closer than you would like them to your event. But it's one of those optics things, or one of those access things that has to come in there. There are the optics of, we don't want our event to look like an imprisoned venue, or, like it's the border between the old Soviet Union and Germany. They want to have a friendlier look or a more palatable vision of that. And, from that kind of thing, you can always do things like banners and fencing and all kinds of messaging that you can do to cover up some of those heavier type of barrier systems to make them look just a little bit more user-friendly and a little more palatable to the public who are going by. The Olympic Games are famous for that. They secure their sites very well, but there's Olympic messaging everywhere on those. So you don't really feel like you are in some kind of a secure zone. It's a lot more of a friendly. And certainly the political optics follow the same. Is a lot of political considerations are like they're public events, even though they are maybe restricted public events. And certainly what Mel talked about with the First Amendment, if you're talking a non-private event where it is whether it's a government type event, summit, presidential level, you certainly have to have the First Amendment considerations in there. And thinking of those through at the start of your perimeter and making sure that those First Amendment requirements are met will save you down the road immensely. And that should always be a part of your messaging and a part of your planning.
Yeah, and then the one area too that I know always gets looked at really hard is not only how do you get them in, but in the event of an emergency, how do you get them out and get them out safe? And that's, a little more inside the perimeter, but it's got to be taken into consideration that you can have some kind of blow open operation where, people can flow out quickly and get away from any potential problems.
Well,
absolutely.
I know a number of the events we've done that we kind of were brought in last minute didn't always take that into consideration. Is people are used to leaving from where they entered, and they're going to beeline to what they're familiar with generally.
That's
case
a very
of some type of catastrophic event.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, because people remember, how did I get in and how did I get to my seat? So having the ability to blow open, large areas of your perimeter near your main entrance points is certainly advantageous. But you also have to have some secondary places where you can just throw the gates open to allow people out in case that area is not accessible. in the event of some kind of an emergency where people can't go that direction. You can't get them, boxed in there. Perfect example is, say, a sports arena or a theater. There are many more emergency exits than there are entrances where the guests come through. And, that's kind of how I would describe needing to set up your perimeter. Is you need to have multiple points of exit while they are secure during the event that you can open in case of an emergency. And you've got to be able to communicate to your attendees how they get to those areas and where they go once they get to them.
I think that's kind of an interesting segue, taking all this stuff into account. I mean, there's a lot to figure out and plan for. Larger events, smaller events. What's the time frame from ideation to creation to installation?
That's really an interesting point, because that is not something you control, being in the security world. You're at the mercy of those people who are planning the event. And if they include you early, then you're in there, you're in sleeves rolled up, and you're part of the planning, and you can help build kind of a more comprehensive and holistic plan that goes with the event. Other times you're handed an event and they say, here's what we're doing. Now secure it, fix it. Example of some of the larger events that I've worked, the NATO summit in Chicago was really great. It was about 10 months that we worked on that event. And I really could have used about another 30 days to just kind of slow the process down, but it was comfortable at 10 months. On the other hand, when we did the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington, D.C., we did that from start to finish in 52 days. And at the time was the largest gathering of foreign leaders on U.S. soil outside of the United Nations. So it was a pretty sizable lift in a very short period of time, less than 2 months. Other times you may have months to plan the simplest of events. Maybe it's a product rollout at a retail outlet or special event, or perhaps it's a board of directors meeting at a hotel or a resort that you're needing to secure. Maybe your board has been somewhat controversial, or your company or product has been controversial, and you expect protests. So, you can't say, wow, I'd really like to have 6 months for everything that I do, because it may not be long enough, or it may be so long that you kind of forget, what you're working on. And I used to have one of my counterparts from one of the other federal agencies in Washington, D.C., who said, we were so skilled at doing those big events in D.C., we could probably plan anything inside of a week. And you saw that with state funerals. Those were things that happened immediately. You got very little notification that it was coming, maybe just a day or so. But we had a lot of that planning done in advance. And so we pulled out the plans, penciled in the names that had changed, and moved forward with it. But that was an ongoing process all the time. And sometimes you would go out and, their environmental areas around a particular site had changed. Maybe a street had been closed, or sidewalk had been moved, and things like that. So, you can't get started too early, but you can get started too early if the work isn't there, or work that needs to be done.
I think that begs the next question. How bad does it get screwed up, with mission creep, and B, when you bring people like Arcus in and us to be the boots on the ground and really kind of go in and sometimes poke holes in the plan, say, oh, here's a new open space where there was a building before on this map, or did we take into account closing off these garages, things along those lines?
Well, a lot of people will try to do these events. Today's generation is, well, I jumped on Google Maps and I looked at Street View and I got this, but nothing substitutes going out and seeing where you're going, taking your roller tape out, seeing what the distances look like, seeing where the actual openings are, alleys, driveways, streets, grassy knolls, whatever you have, there's no substitute for going out and really becoming acclimated to your area, to your perimeter.
And not only that, Mike, let me interrupt here for a second too. Is nothing substitutes for boots on the ground, because that's when you start walking these places and figure out, okay, what kind of businesses are going to be impacted. And you find for instance, a garage that's open to the public 24 hours a day, and you've got to close them down. And you want to put a big old piece of concrete in front of their entrance and exit point, because at a certain point in time, that garage closes. And if there are cars in there, those cars aren't getting out until after the event's over. These are things, though, that can be mitigated with good planning, 72 hours, 24 hours, 6 weeks. and then communication, with the public at large. Here's what the impact is going to be for an event, and that will reduce the heartache and headache level significantly.
Oh, definitely. People often ask me why I felt like I was fairly successful in doing events. And I think probably the biggest thing that I can say is communication and, in relationships is, I would have to say that was probably my strength through all of this, was my ability to build strong relationships with people who were there and tasked with assisting us or specific roles in putting on an event, and then letting those people perform those tasks, let them do their jobs without, micromanaging and, looking over their shoulder or offering them suggestions. Is give them the mission and first let them go out and take part in that mission and see what they come back with. And I think that's, Mel, like you said, the boots on the ground piece. While you're the person who may be responsible for the event, you do need to be out there. You need to have those boots on the ground. You need to be with your vendor so that you understand the ramifications of closing someone's business or someone's garage, because you're ultimately going to be the person that has to go in and negotiate that hands-on, eyes on, hands on, feet walking around is just absolutely, so important to understand that piece of it.
And Mike, you can refute this statement, but I'm going to go back to some of the times that we've worked together in the past. And you have said that the most fun that you have is 2 a.m. in the morning, being out with us and our crews as we're setting stuff up.
It's like you've worked on this and worked on this and worked on this. And it's a lot of fun to see it come together, not just go home and show up and see it all built. It's really fun to see the process. And I think it gets you a lot more connected to your people who are doing the work, to be out there with them. And also, you can see things that you may not like when it's going in, and you have the opportunity at that point to bob and weave a piece of fence or change something that you don't like.
That's the part I didn't like so much, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think you just wanted to go on the gator rides.
The tricked out gators. Well, that was a really good discussion of an event that, whether it's 72 hours, 2 weeks, 180 days, and the planning that goes into building a perimeter. We're in a new day and age now. And what we've seen, unfortunately, over the last year is things that come up that you couldn't plan for had you had the ability to plan for it. Obviously, the loss of property, things like that, certainly could have been mitigated. But Mike, what is your take on, of course, the last 12 months, the different things that we've seen in the news? How would you suggest to someone how to think about those, given a specific flashpoint?
The problem with what's happened over the last year is a lot of it, happened so quickly, particularly if you're a business owner and maybe there was a protest or something in your neighborhood and front of your business was smashed or looted or whatever. You could mitigate that with some barriers. You could mitigate that with boarding up your business. But unfortunately, those things are unpredictable and they happen so quickly, and the crowds are able to move so fast that it's not like you can just pick up the phone and have somebody come and board up your business before people get there. It just doesn't happen that fast. But I do think that we are looking at preparation a little bit more now than we did 12 months ago. And I think you're seeing not only your government entities, but I think you're seeing your private businesses that are saying, you know what, I need to protect my assets. I can't afford to have my store inventory taken. I can't afford, my insurance company's not going to deal with this anymore. And I think you're seeing a lot more of a prudent attitude of trying to just preserve what you have. And they're seeing that the cost of security is now starting to balance with maybe the cost of making an insurance claim or replacing that. But also it's, for me, one of the things I deal with a lot is our company reputation. What in the private sector is it going to look like when the nightly news has the local Apple store with the windows kicked out and it's on fire, where They may have been able to preserve their image a little bit had they taken a step to maybe board up their business, or maybe put some fencing in front of their business like that. So I think you're seeing a lot more focus on existing infrastructure that's there and how to secure it. And I think you're seeing a lot more focus on, I don't want to be the news story. I don't want my store to be what people see if there's been something. I'll just take those steps now to make sure that I can open for my customers within a couple of days.
So it's planning for the worst and hoping for the best.
Absolutely. I'm not a doomsday kind of person. I certainly try to always be a little bit on the optimistic, but yeah, maybe optimistic is the best way to look at it, is what we've got going. But it is definitely
cautiously optimistic.
It is definitely planning for the worst and hoping for the best.
Well, I think moving forward, what do you see as kind of the future of perimeter security? Is it deploying assets all over the place? Is it quick strike forces, because of the way these things can pop up? What do you see? I don't know.
I'm not a person that likes a lot of fence. I'm from the West, and I'm from a family that homesteaded in the West back in the 1800s. And I think, when they strung up barbed wire, that was one of the worst things that, we started doing in this part of the country. So I don't like going around in our cities and seeing fencing and grates on windows and things like that. But I think it's unfortunately becoming a hopefully a temporary necessary evil. But I think having, quick reaction teams that can go out and throw stuff up that can, protect a particular asset, whether it's a government building or something in the private sector, it's being able to protect that asset quickly as conditions change, I think is certainly something that's coming in the future.
Well, it's certain, at Arcus Group, we're constantly searching for kind of what the next iteration of something is going to be, whether it's new product, whatever it is, because we know there are knuckleheads out there and bad actors that are looking to impact something at every possible turn.
Right. It's funny when you talk about whether they're high profile criminal cases or what. I can recall, this is many, many years ago in Jacksonville, Florida, the trial of Carlos Later, who was the first Colombian cartel member extradited to the United States. They put sandbags out on the street around the federal courthouse and bike rack, because that's really all there was at the time. That was all that was available. And they feared Colombian cartel bombing of the courthouse during the Later trial. The same thing, you fast forward to Denver. I was living in Denver, and you had the Timothy McVeigh trial for the Oklahoma City bombing. And it was the same. Sandbags, it was bike rack. It wasn't a real large security presence because they were afraid, that his patriots would come and bomb the federal courthouse in Denver. But, technology, and unfortunately for explosive devices through the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and the use of IEDs in those places, have greatly enhanced our ability to secure sites in the United States against explosive threats. And so we can see that standoff is really what we need. And certainly there are other mitigations like buses or large trucks that we can use to help mitigate a blast. But what we've learned from that and how we secure those types of real high threat environments has just changed immensely in the last 30 years.
Well, and it kind of takes me back to the old adage that we've all heard 1,000 times, is in the job that we have collectively done and continue to do, we've got to be right 100% of the time. The bad guys only got to be right once.
Yep. Absolutely. It only takes one piece of your perimeter that's maybe not secured for a crowd to get through, or it takes one piece of vehicle mitigation that's a little too close and something gets too close to your event. I mean, those little types of things are what someone who's planning a coordinated attack against your event can definitely exploit.
For those of you who are tuning in that might not be as familiar with what we're talking about, although it's been all over the news, an IED is an improvised explosive device. Sometimes we tend to get too technical because this is the lingo that we live with.
Well, and to give you how simple it is, I mean, Timothy McVeigh had diesel fuel, fertilizer, and a rental truck, and he completely destroyed the federal office building in Oklahoma City. It doesn't take a large device, and it doesn't take things that are only available to the military, and it doesn't take something crafted in a foreign country to cause that kind of devastation here in our own country. It can be completely stuff that you can buy at your local store, and all you have to do is know how to put it together.
Yeah, I mean,
No, that's exactly right.
Look at what just happened Christmas Day in Nashville.
Exactly, right there. How do you mitigate that? I mean, that is it was just an ordinary neighborhood in a medium-sized city here in our country, and suddenly somebody decided to do something bad. I mean, that's literally what happened, which means when you are planning an event, you are doing something that you think might be a little bit more controversial, might attract something like that. It really is upon you to take the precautions necessary to secure that event and to secure it properly.
That's absolutely right. So if we can segue from the gloom and the doom and go into what I will consider my favorite part of this podcast, PJ, what you got?
I'm a little curious right now. I'm not quite ready to get off of the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about. I wanted to ask kind of Mike, with the trial coming up in Minnesota in the tragic death of George Floyd, the officer involved in that. Looking at in the grander scheme of things, there is able to be some planning for that now. None of us have the intel that they've got, obviously. What do you see kind of going on there? What kind of steps might you take to mitigate any potential risks?
There's a lot of really sensitive issues at play right there. And number one is, do you invite violence if you build it like a fortress? Are you setting that kind of mentality in motion to say, you know what, we're gonna sandbag and we're gonna fence this courthouse in, and nobody's gonna get close? Are you taking that ability for those people who might want to be there to either protest or whatever it is, get their voice heard? Is that perceived as taking that away from them if you make that like a fence? Or when you put up that fence, are you saying, bring the fight, we're ready for it? Or do you try to go out into your communities ahead of time, work with your communities, try to dispel any of the violent feelings that might come up, any of the concerns, but still have the ability to quickly turn on a high-speed security plan where you may get through one night, but by sunrise the next morning, you're putting up something that's on site, ready to go should things go south on you. That may be a little too touchy-feely for some of our law enforcement types, but you get to certain thresholds that you can't turn back from. And so if you set the tone of, we're going to let you protest, we're going to let you be out here, but if you have good intelligence on who your troublemakers are and what's going on, can you work with that to try to dispel some of that violence and that? But I think you have to have a ready-made security plan ready to go.
Thank you. All these things being top of mind, top of news, we just really like some insight. You really love getting your insight into that.
I was involved in in some rioting back in the late 90s, and that case that we had where, did we have an appropriate response to respond to? There was some college rioting, and we really didn't the first night, and we didn't have chemical munitions adequate enough to deal with that. We didn't have our field forces in place or anything like that, but we learned over subsequent nights that we had that, and we were able to put that in motion. And I think that's kind of the same thing you have to have here. You have to see, what is it starting, take the temperature and what's it starting to look like.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to do so much as to encourage, but you want to do enough to protect.
Exactly. It's what tone are you setting?
Well, and especially emotionally charged issues like these are, what's the match that's going to light the final wick on the powder keg? Is you don't want to provide that, but you got to be ready for it to happen. And it's as you said, Mike, a super delicate balance.
Yeah, you don't want to be out there looking like you're ready for war when nobody has that in their mind until they see you.
So what was, and this could be two separate things, either the most concerning, I don't want to say scariest, but the most concerning and the most humorous or funniest experience that you've had in your many, many years of doing what you've done?
The most concerning learning event, and probably what I think is the funniest, are all the same event. And that was in 2012, just getting ready to kick off the 2012 North American or North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO summit in Chicago. Perimeter was up, all the vehicle mitigation assets were in place. It had to be sometime after midnight, so it was fairly quiet. And I was over on the east side of what was our perimeter, which was very large, near Soldier Field in Chicago, when I heard just an awful crash occur somewhere to the west of me. I started driving around our perimeter and suddenly got a call on the radio that we'd had a vehicle had crashed into our perimeter, I believe over on Cernak in Chicago.
Yep. I remember
And
that.
I took a little drive over on Cernak around State Street. We had large concrete barrier set in front of our fence, which was our perimeter. And if I remember right, we had it cross. I can't remember if we had it crossways on the street or if we had it in kind of a church pew fashion, long ways on the street.
No, we had it parallel. We had it parallel with the street because they were also going to use that to push protesters and kind of start dividing protesters as well.
Right. And that's something you can do with things like your concrete barriers. You don't have to put it crossways. You can put it long ways so that people can pass through it and do that kind of thing. So as I drove up, what I saw was a new Porsche Cayenne literally split in half after hitting one of our concrete barriers at about 60 or 70 miles an hour. Both occupants of the car were out walking around, which says a lot about the building of the Porsche Cayenne and the ability to sustain a serious automobile accident. But it also, what it did do is it kind of drove a couple things to me as a learning experience. First of all, as big and heavy as that concrete barrier was, this Porsche Cayenne was able to defeat it. Now, that car wasn't able to go any further, but if you were to follow that up with maybe a secondary or third vehicle, you would have breached our fence. Now, we had other mitigations in place behind that fence and before you actually got to that fence that would have prohibited that, which is something to always think about, is what happens if they defeat one level of your security? Do you have a follow-up level behind it? And so it was a huge learning experience for me as to why we do multiple levels of vehicle mitigation just for that. It was humorous because this car was just totally unbelievable. And that the passengers were out walking around, both of them intoxicated, totally didn't even see it coming, didn't see any of the signage that the street was closed. But it was very discerning as to what a small, high-speed vehicle can do to defeat your perimeter. And, we talk a lot about high-speed avenues of approach when we're kind of trying to defeat a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. And this was a perfect example of a high-speed avenue of approach and a vehicle hitting our perimeter at a high speed.
All right. So Mel, what's your favorite, scariest, funniest?
Well, the scariest one project that I ever worked on involved 3 cities, 6 days, and having to prepare all 3 of them simultaneously. I'm not going to go into the weeds on exactly what it was, but having 3 teams plus 3 essentially duplicate sets of assets in each city, none of which could be transported to the next city. Looking at that, from a high altitude, just scared the bejesus out of me. But once, and this kind of circles back to our main point, once we were able to start peeling the layers of the onion back and walking the different sites and determining what assets needed to go where and when, and developing a comprehensive plan that supported all that, then it almost seemed like, why was I so scared? So it just reproves the point of having experienced, tactical, strategic thinkers, if that's kind of a non sequitur, involved in that particular plan. There's nothing ever so big that it should cause anyone to panic. And PJ, I mean, you and I have worked these events before. Mike, you've kind of helped us be at the table on numerous occasions. And once it's up, and this is where I go back to Mike, once it's up, you kind of stand back in awe and you go, yeah, we did that and it worked. And as long as the whole can go to sleep in their hotels at night and no one has, been seriously injured or died, that's a success.
That brings me to my kind of favorite and scariest is these events were kind of the birth of Arcus. This is where we cut our chops in the security world. That's where we learned to create the risk mitigation. Half the time I don't know whether to thank you or curse you, but because of what we've learned through you guys and with you, Mike, and your brethren that we still work with, we've learned how to come in and kind of consult and say, hey, look, yeah, here's your 30,000 foot plan, but you've got holes all over here. Again, it's where we cut our teeth. We've been doing production on various levels forever. It's and we're thrilled that we've had the chance to work with you, Mike, even though when I first met you, I asked you for a coin and you said, I don't know you. You gave me a pin, but what are you going to do?
Was I that rude?
You just kind of looked at me sideways saying, we haven't really met yet. I said, hey, I'm PJ. You said, okay, you get a pin.
Yeah. Let's see, going back to that relationship management discussion, to actually those points, Mike and PJ, I mean, you both get this as someone that comes in that's providing assets to a group that has probably lived and breathed this longer than when we get to the table. You have to have a good degree of diplomacy in pointing out flaws, because there are some that don't like those to be pointed out, but that's why we, PJ, you, me, our crew, that's why we get brought to the table, is to poke holes in these. Yes, this particular asset will work here, but if you try this other asset or combine it with something, you're going to have a much higher probability of defeating a potential problem. That always gets challenging.
And I think that quite honestly is where Arcus adds the most value.
I totally agree.
Anyone in an event company can order a tent, but it takes a trained eye like we have at Arcus to really go and see where the holes are. And I'm not talking, necessarily federal. I'm at all levels. There's like, have you thought about this? Okay, this is your fantastic shot. Why do you have porta potties right next to it where where you're serving your food, or where there's some things people don't think about.
Yep, you're exactly right.
I like to point out is really the big events at a federal or presidential level, they're really easier than a smaller event that may be being put on by a private party or private sector business. You have all the assets at your disposal. You have laws that allow you to make closures or do things like that. But when you're really dealing with something that you're trying to secure and you're a private business, you really need that expertise, because you've got to think outside the box. You don't have all those tools available to you. So you have to use that limited amount of room that you have to perform this. And you really need to have people there that, can think outside the box and can put that together for you.
That's actually a really good point, because some of us have been spoiled at the level that we've worked at. But when you take it down to a private sector level, there are so many things that we do, even at the large level, that can easily transition to the smaller private level. A lot of what that is just contacts that you make. How many people would know that you can ask for police support and you might get it, or you can actually hire off-duty cops? And I hope I'm not giving away a trade secret, but when you're setting up a private event, you may very well need some off-duty paid, uniform police presence. That's in most every city I've ever worked to is very easy to procure.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and we look at that. So it's this has been a fun discussion. I always like talking to you guys. Mike, thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your day. I hope you've been recovered from your big event yesterday. And, I just want to thank our listeners for joining Arcus on the start of your perimeter journey. We hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as we had having it. A few technical issues aside, hopefully we'll get those ironed out someday. In the coming weeks, we're going to have a number of discussions covering all different assets of security and different types of planning, whether it's communications, to different assets that we use. We touched on a few of them today. The future of festivals. We'll be talking about a whole lot of stuff. Well, we hope you'll come back and give us another listen.
Yeah, and Mike, I want to throw my thanks in there as well. It's great to relive some of our fun moments together, and thank you for sharing your knowledge to the group of listeners. And I'm sure that they'll be able to take something away from this and look forward to the next one. So I'm Mel Lukens with PJ O'Neill, and we'll see you in a few weeks. In the meantime, stay safe, keep your head on a swivel, and always check your six.
The world is constantly changing. Event hosts must account for potential bad actors at every venue. New threats are emerging seemingly every day, and through our work with the highest levels of law enforcement, Arcus Group can help design event plans to counter even the most serious threats posed. Where Arcus Group really adds value is less in the acquiring of assets or fence or concrete or vehicle barriers, though we are expert in those. Where Arcus Group shines is in a consultative role. There is always immense planning that goes into event security, but it is often done from a 30,000-foot view. Arcus Group provides the boots on the ground knowledge and expertise to poke holes in even the most comprehensive plans. As Mike Tyson so famously said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Arcus Group will keep you from getting punched in the mouth.
And don't forget to keep managing your perimeter.